Eli wasn't sure when the rooftop had become his refuge. Maybe it was sometime during the first sleepless nights after he moved in, when the walls of his apartment felt too close and his thoughts too loud. The building wasn't anything special, just a modest five-story structure wedged between a row of cafes and a laundromat. But the roof? That was different. There was something calming about being above the city. The noise faded into a distant hum, the kind that reminded him of static or wind through trees. Up here, no one asked him questions. No one demanded answers. Just the quiet company of the skyline and the soft shift of colors as the sun sank behind the buildings. He didn't expect anyone else to be there. The rooftop was usually empty after 6 p.m., the occasional tenant passing through to smoke or take a phone call. But on a Thursday evening in late April, just as Eli settled into his usual spot near the railing with a sketchpad balanced on his knees, the door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly trimmed hair and a jacket slung casually over one arm. He moved with the kind of calm that came from long days and well-worn routines. He didn't seem surprised to see Eli there, just offered a brief nod before walking to the opposite side of the roof. Eli responded with a faint nod of his own, heart tapping a little harder in his chest. The man settled near the far corner, where the shadows stretched longest. He set down a glass bottle, wine perhaps, and pulled out a small notebook. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sky faded from pale peach to dusky purple as the city shifted beneath them. Windows flickered on across buildings, traffic slowed, the wind cooled. Eli tried to return his focus to the sketch in front of him, a skyline study, loose and unfinished, but he found his attention drifting. There was something about the man's stillness, not stiff or guarded, just intentional, as if he was exactly where he needed to be. Eli couldn't remember the last time someone had made silence feel like a presence instead of an absence. The man stayed for about an hour. Then, without a word, he stood, packed his things, and slipped back through the rooftop door. Eli exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. The next evening, he returned to the roof at the same time, half expecting to be alone. But just as the sky began to darken, the door opened again. Same man, same quiet nod. This time they sat a little closer, not close, just less far. The pattern continued. Each night, they arrived with barely a greeting, settled into opposite ends of the roof, and existed in parallel silence. Eli brought a sketch pad. The man brought a notebook and occasionally a glass of red wine. Neither asked the other's name. Neither broke the spell. There was comfort in the repetition, the way the city's breath slowed with them, the way dusk stretched longer when shared. By the end of the first week, Eli had stopped pretending it was coincidence. He began to notice things, the way the man tilted his head while reading, how he rolled up his sleeves just before sunset, how he closed his notebook at exactly the same moment the first streetlight flickered on below. And still, no words. That was what made it feel real. Unforced. One night, the man brought a small portable speaker and played a jazz track low enough that it barely reached Eli's ears. He didn't mind. It suited the evening, the sound of brass and bass melting into the skyline. Eli looked over just once, catching the faint curve of a smile on the man's face as he watched the horizon. It was the first time Eli let himself wonder what that smile might look like up close. The wind picked up, brushing strands of his hair across his forehead. He didn't move them. He just kept sketching, heart humming with a rhythm that had nothing to do with pencil on paper. He didn't know what this was, or what it could become. But in a world that often asked him to explain himself, justify his quietness, and make noise to be seen, this felt like the opposite, like an invitation to simply exist. The man left again, same as always. No bourbier. No explanation. Eli remained on the roof a little longer, watching the stars appear one by one. His sketchpad lay open beside him, forgotten. There was something about the air up here, something about sharing it with someone who didn't ask for anything in return. Whatever it was, he knew he would come back tomorrow, and he hoped the man would, too. By the second week, the rooftop no longer felt like a place Eli visited. It had become part of his daily rhythm, an unspoken pause between the noise of work and the quiet loneliness of his apartment. And though neither of them said it aloud, He knew it had become the same for the man with the wine and the notebook. They continued their silent evenings together. No formal introductions, no casual chatter. Just a quiet ritual that unfolded between them like a long breath at the end of a long day. But silence, when repeated often enough, begins to speak for itself. One evening, the air was unusually still, heavy with the scent of warm pavement and distant jasmine. Eli arrived first. He took his usual spot, opened his sketch pad, and tried to draw the line of the skyline as it dipped behind the nearby buildings. The lines came slowly. His hand felt less steady than usual. When the door clicked open, he glanced up instinctively. The man appeared, slightly flushed from the stairs, a thermos in one hand instead of his usual wine bottle. His gaze met Eli's briefly, and for the first time, he offered something more than a nod. A small, fleeting smile. It wasn't big, just enough to change the shape of the evening. They sat in their usual places, maybe a foot closer now, the quiet stretching comfortably between them. Eli didn't sketch that night. He simply sat with his knees pulled to his chest, watching the light shift on the windows across the street. A soft breeze moved through the rooftop, lifting the corners of the man's notebook and ruffling the hem of Eli's hoodie. The city below them shimmered with the golden glow of early evening. It felt like being suspended between two worlds, one of routine and one of possibility. After a while, Eli heard the man close his notebook with a quiet snap. He looked up and found him already watching the horizon. His posture was relaxed, his gaze somewhere far away. And then, without turning, the man finally spoke. "Nice up here." The words were simple, unobtrusive, but they felt monumental in the space they broke. Eli nodded slowly, unsure whether to respond out loud. Eventually, he just said, "Yeah." The conversation didn't go further. It didn't need to. It was enough that the silence had shifted, thinned into something new. The next evening, it was Eli who arrived second. As he stepped onto the roof, he noticed the man had brought 2 cups this time, ceramic, not paper, and a small thermos nestled between them. He hesitated before walking over. The man gave him the smallest gesture, a slight tilt of the head, then turned his attention back to the sky. Eli took a seat nearby. The man poured from the thermos into one of the cups and placed it on the ground beside Eli's foot. No explanation, no pressure. Eli picked it up, cradling it in his hands. It was warm, chamomile and something slightly citrusy. Comfort in liquid form. They sat that way for a while, side by side, not touching, not speaking. And yet, the connection between them grew stronger with each sip, each shared glance at the sky, each quiet exhale. Eli began to notice more details. The slight creases at the corners of the man's eyes. The way he rubbed the bridge of his nose when thinking. The calm intensity that lingered behind his quietness. There was strength in his stillness. And Eli found himself drawn to it. Not out of curiosity, but recognition. He saw something familiar in the way the man sat alone. A kind of quiet ache that matched his own. When the man eventually stood, he paused before leaving. His eyes met Eli's again. There was something unspoken in the look, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that this had become more than a coincidence. Eli watched the door close behind him. The next night, they didn't speak, but they shared the tea again, and the silence, now softer, wrapped around them like a blanket. As the days passed, the boundary between them blurred. Their movements began to mirror one another, reaching for their cups at the same time, standing just a second too long before leaving. One night, a plane passed overhead, its blinking light trailing across the stars. Eli looked up, then glanced toward the man. He was watching the plane too, his expression thoughtful, almost wistful. In that moment, Eli wondered what had brought him here, what weight he carried, what heartbreak lived in the shadows behind his eyes. He didn't ask. He just watched the sky with him. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. By the 3rd week, the rooftop meetings had become something sacred, unscheduled but expected, unspoken but deeply felt. Eli never confirmed it aloud, but his evenings began to orbit around that hour, when the city started to dim and the skyline caught fire with the last light of day. He found himself preparing for those rooftop visits with quiet intention. Making tea, choosing warmer layers when the breeze turned cool. Sometimes he brought his sketchbook, sometimes he didn't. It no longer mattered what he carried with him, only that he showed up. And Marcus, Eli had learned his name from a parcel mistakenly left in the lobby, always did the same. He never arrived late, never left early. His presence was dependable in a way that felt steadying. Until the night, he didn't come. The evening began like any other. Eli climbed the stairs with a thermos in hand. A hint of hope curled quietly inside his chest. The sky was clear, the breeze soft. The roof glowed in its usual dusky light. But Marcus wasn't there. Ili waited. First 5 minutes, then 10, then 30. He sat in his usual spot, watching the horizon swallow the last line of sunlight, trying not to fidget. Try not to look at the door every few seconds. Try not to feel the growing hollow in his chest. It was strange how quickly absence could feel so heavy. He told himself Marcus had probably been delayed. Maybe work ran late. Maybe he wasn't feeling well. Maybe it was nothing. But the truth was, Eli had come to depend on his presence. Not in any possessive way, but like the rhythm of a breath. You don't realize how much you rely on it until it catches in your chest. The rooftop felt different without him. Wider. Emptier. The sounds of the city below were sharper tonight. A car alarm in the distance. Someone yelling 3 buildings over. The clink of glass bottles in a recycling bin on the corner. All the sounds that had blurred background noise now pressed louder against his ears. Eli stayed longer than usual. He watched the first stars come out, counted them like they might distract him from the silence beside him. But it didn't work. Eventually, he packed up and went back inside. That night, sleep came slowly. He lay awake with the window cracked open, letting the night air drift across his skin. He listened to the hum of passing cars, the faint metallic squeal of the elevator shaft down the hall, the familiar rhythm of the city refusing to rest. His thoughts kept circling the same point. Why did it matter this much? It wasn't like they were close. They'd barely exchanged more than a few words. They didn't even know each other in the way people usually do. But maybe that was why it mattered. Because sometimes it's the unspoken connections that pierce deepest. The ones that grow not through noise, but through presence. The next day felt off. Eli moved through work on autopilot, his focus scattered. Designs half-finished. Messages left unanswered. The thought of that empty rooftop kept tugging at him, like a thread he couldn't stop pulling. That evening, he almost didn't go up. Part of him feared repeating the night before, that familiar disappointment settling back into his chest like dust. But habit, or maybe hope, pushed him toward the stairs. The rooftop was quiet again. Still, but this time there was something different. A single folded note rested where Marcus usually sat, weighed down by a smooth, flat stone. Eli froze. His fingers hesitated before lifting the note. The paper was thick, the kind used by people who still valued handwriting. There was no envelope. Just a few words, carefully written. Sorry I missed last night. Needed air. Back soon. M. That was all. But Eli read it 3 times. The curve of the letters, the pause after the first sentence. The signature, minimal but intentional. It said more than a paragraph ever could. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Marcus hadn't vanished. He hadn't broken the pattern. He just needed space. Eli understood that. Deeply, he tucked the note into his pocket, sat down in his usual place, and poured himself a cup of tea. The wind was colder tonight, brushing against his cheeks with sharp fingers. But he didn't mind. He was alone again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like waiting. The note stayed in Eli's jacket pocket for days. It was folded neatly, its edges beginning to soften with each time he smoothed it open and read the short message again. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't need to. It wasn't about what the note said. It was about the fact that it existed. Someone had noticed the space he once filled. Someone had wanted to explain their absence. And that someone was Marcus. Eli continued his rooftop visits, unsure of whether Marcus would return that week. Some evenings he found himself lingering by the stairwell, half listening for the creak of the rooftop door behind him. Other nights, he simply sat in silence, sketchbook closed in his lap, watching the stars blink into view. Then, on a Tuesday evening, just as the last streaks of sun dipped beneath the skyline, Eli looked up and saw Marcus. He was standing by the doorway, one hand resting on the frame as if testing the air before stepping through. His eyes scanned the roof, landed on Eli, and for a moment he just stood there. Then he walked over. No words, just the quiet click of his boots against concrete and the soft weight of his presence. He sat down beside Eli, not at a distance like before, but close enough that their shoulders could have brushed if either shifted slightly. There was something different in the air, still calm, but filled with awareness. The silence returned, but it was no longer the same. It wasn't a wall between them. It was a bridge, fragile and new. Eli didn't ask where Marcus had been. He didn't need to. His presence tonight was answer enough. They sat like that for a long while, drinking in the view together. The city lights blinked alive one by one. A couple argued in a neighboring apartment. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed and disappeared. Above them, the sky opened wide, vast, unbothered, ancient. Eli leaned back on his elbows and looked up, letting the chill of the concrete seep into his arms. The stars were clearer than usual. Fewer clouds, less light pollution. Next to him, Marcus mirrored the movement. Their shoulders now almost touched. A few minutes passed. Eli spoke first. Only a whisper meant more for the night than for Marcus. My mom used to say that the sky listens better than people do. It was the first deeply personal thing he had shared, and it hung in the air like breath on glass. He didn't look at Marcus when he said it. He wasn't sure he could, but after a few heartbeats, he felt movement. Marcus nodded, slow and deliberate. He didn't reply, but his silence felt warm, understanding, not dismissive. That small exchange opened a door, not one that slammed wide open, but one that creaked just enough to let light spill through. They began showing up on the roof earlier. Sometimes Marcus brought a blanket or coffee in tall, insulated mugs. Eli brought his drawings, though he rarely drew anymore. Instead, he watched the skyline, the shifting clouds, and Marcus. One night, Marcus pulled a folded piece of paper from his notebook and handed it over without a word. Eli opened it, expecting a note, but instead found a simple sketch. A cityscape, drawn loosely but with an architect's touch. Clean lines, careful angles, perspective aligned, just so. It was the view from the roof. His view. Eli looked at Marcus, something like surprise flickering in his chest. Marcus gave a small shrug, a half-smile tugging at one side of his mouth. They didn't say anything, but something clicked into place. From that night on, the space between them grew thinner. Marcus began sharing stories, quietly, in fragments. A design project that failed. A friend he hadn't called back. A marriage that ended in silence rather than shouting. The kind of heartbreak that leaves more questions than answers. Eli Listennet. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix. Instead, he offered stillness. And in return, he began to share too. About the move. The job that kept him awake at night. The fear of not being enough in a world that demanded confidence from people who never had the chance to build it. They didn't always respond to each other's words. Sometimes they just nodded. Sometimes they offered a single sentence, soft as a thread. But it was enough. Their routine shifted again, not in what they did, but in what they allowed. The rooftop no longer felt like a hiding place. It had become something else entirely. A space they both chose. One evening, as the wind moved gently around them and the sky faded to deep navy, their arms brushed. Neither pulled away. They didn't speak. They simply looked up and shared the sky. The rooftop had always felt like an escape, a place above the noise, apart from the pulse of the city. But now for Eli, it felt more like a rival, like something he hadn't known he'd been searching for until he found it in the quiet presence of another person. Not in grand gestures or declarations, but in shared glances, steady breathing, and the space where words weren't needed. Spring shifted into early summer. The air stayed warmer longer. The lights below glowed later into the night. Rooftop visits stretched with the season. No longer fleeting moments before sleep, but lingering hours marked by silence, then stories, then shared stillness. Eli and Marcus didn't define what they were. There was no need. What they had wasn't sudden. It had taken time to build, a slow layering of trust, observation, and unspoken connection. They had formed a kind of gravity between them, subtle but inescapable. That night, the sky was cloudless. The moon hung low, casting pale silver across the rooftop tiles. Eli arrived just after 9, thermos in hand, sketchbook under one arm, though he hadn't opened in days. Marcus was already there. He was seated on the blanket he now brought regularly, back resting against the short wall that edged the building. The familiar 2 mugs sat between them. Eli crossed the rooftop without hesitation and sat beside him. Their shoulders brushed. Neither of them adjusted. The city below was quieter than usual. Fewer horns, less chatter from open windows. It was as if the entire block had paused to let them breathe. Eli sipped his tea slowly, letting the warmth fill his chest. He could feel Marcus's breath beside him, measured, even. For a long time, they didn't speak. The stillness was complete, full of meaning, full of choice. Then Marcus shifted slightly and looked out at the skyline. He didn't face Eli directly, but his voice, when it came, was softer than usual, like something pulled gently from a thought that had lived in him for a long time. I used to be afraid of heights. Eli turned his head, not expecting that. Marcus continued, his eyes still on the horizon. I hated looking down, the feeling that everything could fall apart with one misstep. A pause. But up here doesn't feel like that. Eli didn't respond, not with words. He just reached over, fingers brushing against Marcus's hand resting on the blanket. Marcus didn't pull away. Their fingers remained loosely intertwined. No pressure, just contact. It was the first time they'd touched like that. Not incidentally, not momentarily, but deliberately. Below them, a train rumbled past in the distance. A dog barked twice, then quieted. The hum of the city returned gently to its rhythm, but they remained still. Eli looked up at the stars, then over at Marcus. In the soft light, his features seemed less guarded, more open, like he'd finally allowed the weight on his shoulders to be seen. "You're not afraid now?" Eli asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus shook his head just once. "Not with you here." The words were simple, but in them was everything Eli hadn't known how to say. The breeze moved around them, carrying with it the scent of warm stone, flowering balconies, and distant memories. Eli leaned into Marcus just slightly, letting his head rest lightly against his shoulder. They stayed like that as the night deepened, not looking down, not thinking of what this was called, just breathing, just being. When it was finally time to go, they stood together. No ruse. No need to say anything. Marcus walked Eli to the rooftop door. Before stepping through, Eli paused. He turned, looked at the rooftop behind them, then back at Marcus. He smiled, quiet, certain. Marcus returned it, and for a moment, the air between them felt like an answered question. Eli descended the stairs slowly. With each step, he felt something settle in him. Something he hadn't known was loose. That night, as he lay in bed, the sounds of the city curled around him like waves. But this time, he wasn't thinking of what might happen next. He wasn't overanalyzing every glance, every silence. He simply thought of the rooftop, of Marcus, of the way the city had disappeared around them when they shared the sky. And for the first time in a long time, Eli fell asleep smiling.